The March wind came down off the Berkshires the way it always did in western Massachusetts that year, sharp as a watchmaker's file carrying the smell of melting snow and wet pine and the river that ran black through the valley floor. It was a wind that did not knock. It went straight through a man's coat and found whatever was thin beneath it. Wren Caldwell knelt on the plank floor of a clockmaker's shop that had not been opened in 55 years. She was 20 years old. She had $10 left to her name when the morning began, and she had spent it on the deed to this building. She had 2 pairs of socks, a canvas messenger bag, a brass loop on a leather cord around her neck, and a set of watchmaker's screwdrivers that had belonged to her grandmother. She had nothing else. She had no one else. The boarded-up display window let in only a knife of late afternoon light. It fell across the floor in a long, pale stripe and caught the dust that hung in the air the way dust hangs in a barn after a horse has stamped its hoof. The dust had been there a long time. The dust had been waiting. In her hands she held a folded letter. The paper was the color of old tea. It had been written, she could see now, with the kind of fountain pen no one used anymore, by a hand that had pressed each letter down with care, because the man writing it had known that whoever read it would not have the chance to ask him a single question. In front of her on the floor lay 6 brass screws. They were brighter than anything else in this room. She had backed them out one by one from the rear panel of a tall mahogany regulator clock that stood against the back wall like a sentry that had forgotten the war was over. Behind that panel she had found a wall cavity. Inside the cavity she had found a coiled mainspring in a brass barrel, a heavy canvas pouch, and this letter. Her hands were shaking. They were not shaking from cold. She read the first line. To whoever finds this spring. She did not read the rest. Not yet. She set the letter down on her knee, and she pressed both palms flat against the cold plank floor, and she breathed in the smell of 55 years of stillness, and she understood, in the way a person understands a thing all at once and never afterward forgets it, that her life had just split into a before and an after. Outside, the bell of the Congregational Church on the hill struck 4 times. The sound came in muffled through the boarded window. Somewhere on Mill Street, a car door closed. A man called out to a dog. The town of Montague Center went on with its small Saturday business, unaware that anything had changed. Inside the shop, in the dust, in the slanting light, the second hand of the great regulator did not move. Not yet. Wren Caldwell had grown up listening to the inside of clocks. Not the outside sound, not the ticking that any person could hear if they walked into a room with the clock on the mantel. The inside sound, the whisper underneath the whisper, the click of an escapement leasing one tooth at a time, the small mechanical sigh of a mainspring giving up its energy in a thin, steady stream. The faint asymmetry no louder than a moth's wing against a lampshade that told you a clock was running fast, or running slow, or limping toward a stop it would not announce until it had already happened. She had learned to hear that sound the way other children learn to hear the difference between a robin and a sparrow. Her grandmother had taught her. Her grandmother's name was Eleanor Caldwell, and she had been the last working watch repair woman in Franklin County. She had repaired, by her own modest estimate, somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 watches and clocks across 33 years of working life. The mantel clocks of farm wives in Buckland, the pocket watches of railroad men in Greenfield, the grandfather clocks of bankers in Northampton, the wristwatches of teenagers and widowers and country doctors and boys going off to college. They had all come at one time or another across Eleanor Caldwell's bench, and they had all been listened to before they had been touched. Eleanor had not started as a watch repair woman. She had started in the spring of 1961 as a 19-year-old shop girl hired by an old jeweler named Mr. Ellsworth to sweep his floor and polish his display cases and answer his telephone in a small shop on Main Street in Greenfield. She had been hired for the dollar an hour. She had been kept within her first month for something else. Mr. Ellsworth had noticed it on a Tuesday morning. Eleanor was dusting a display case. 3 watches lay open on the counter in front of him. He had been about to write up the timing tickets when he stopped, and he looked at the girl with the dust rag, and he said in a voice that was almost casual, "Eleanor, come here a moment." She came over. He said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer with what your ears tell you, not what you think I want to hear. One of these 3 watches is running correctly. One is gaining about 2 seconds a day. One is losing about 4 seconds a day. Listen and tell me which is which." Eleanor stood very still over the counter for perhaps 15 seconds. The shop was silent except for the 3 small ticking sounds. Then she pointed. "That one is running right. That one is fast. That one is slow." Mr. Ellsworth looked at her over the rim of his glasses for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said quietly, "You have the ear, Eleanor. I have been looking for someone with the ear for 20 years. He trained her. Across the next 5 years, he taught her every single thing he knew. How to disassemble a movement plate by plate. How to clean each pivot in benzene with a horsehair brush no thicker than an eyelash. How to inspect a mainspring for the hairline fatigue cracks that meant it would fail within the year. How to seat a hairspring so that it breathed in perfect circles. How to listen to an escapement and hear in the rhythm of its tick whether the pallet was striking true." By 1966, Eleanor could do everything Mr. Ellsworth could do, and a few things he could not, because her ear was finer than his had ever been. That spring, on a Friday afternoon, Mr. Ellsworth signed the deed of the shop over to her for the legal sum of $1. He told her the price of the inventory was the next 33 years of her life. He told her she was going to spend them taking care of the shop. He turned out to be correct on both counts. Eleanor ran the shop on Main Street in Greenfield from 1966 until 1999, when arthritis made the fine work impossible. She married in 1965 a high school physics teacher named Walter Caldwell, who taught at Greenfield High for 28 years and who understood in the precise way that physics teachers understand things that his wife's gift was not magic, but a specific neurological capacity for fine pitch discrimination, perfectly suited to the one trade in the world where pitch discrimination paid the rent. Walter Caldwell never once complained about the smell of benzene on his wife's fingers at supper. He died in 1998. Eleanor closed the shop a year later after 56 birthdays. Eleanor and Walter had one son. His name was Curtis. Curtis Caldwell was Wren's father for the first 6 years of Wren's life, and then he was not her father for the next 14, because Curtis was a man who could not stop drinking. He lost custody of Wren when she was 6. He died of liver failure in a halfway house in Springfield when she was 12. He had never married Wren's mother, a woman named Marin, who had left Greenfield when Wren was 2 years old and had never come back. Wren did not know where Marin was. She had stopped wondering when she was 10. The state of Massachusetts placed her when she was 6 with a family in Greenfield named the Warrens. Vernon and Beth Warren. They were decent people. They were decent in the limited and accurate way that good foster parents are decent. They fed her, they clothed her, they drove her to school in the mornings, and they signed her permission slips, and they bought her a winter coat every 2 years from the Sears and Hadley. They also did not love her exactly because the Warrens had 3 biological children of their own, and Wren had understood at the age of 6 without anyone telling her the unspoken hierarchy of the household. Biological children first, foster child second. She had been second for 12 years. She had learned to occupy less space than she needed. She had learned to need less attention than she required. She had learned to make herself small enough that the household could continue to accommodate her the way a careful guest learns the habits of a kitchen in which she is not entirely welcome. She slept after the youngest Warren boy turned 12 and needed his own bedroom on a fold-out cot in the alcove at the end of the upstairs hallway. The cot had a thin mattress and a crocheted afghan that smelled faintly of cedar. The cot had been comfortable enough. The fixed point in Wren's universe was Eleanor. Every Saturday from the age of 6, Wren walked the 2 miles from the Warrens' house on Federal Street to Eleanor's house on Elm Street in any weather, in winter coats too thin and summer shoes too small with the loop on its leather cord around her neck, because Eleanor had given her that loop for her 7th birthday and had told her never to take it off when she was working. Eleanor had set up a small repair bench in her kitchen after closing the shop. Longtime customers still brought their pieces to her, the ones who could not bear the idea of letting any other hands than Eleanor's touch their grandmother's clocks. They came to the back door and they sat at the kitchen table, and Eleanor served them coffee, and after they left, she carried the work to the bench in the corner under the south window, where the light was best in the late morning, and she sat there with Wren on a wooden stool beside her, and she taught her granddaughter how to listen. The first lesson came the first Saturday. Wren was 6 years old. She had been at the Warrens for 3 weeks. She had cried herself to sleep every one of those nights into the corner of the unfamiliar pillow where no one could hear. She had not cried in front of any person. Eleanor did not ask her about it. Eleanor set a small mantel clock on the bench, a plain walnut, Seth Thomas with a brass dial, and she said in a voice that was neither soft nor hard, but exactly even, "Press your ear against the case. Tell me what you hear." Wren pressed her ear to the warm wood. "Ticking," she said. "Listen harder," Eleanor said. "The ticking is the outside of the clock. I want you to hear the inside." Wren listened harder. After a long moment, she heard beneath the ticking a smaller and more precise sound. A click and a release. A click and a release. Quiet, steady. "That's the escapement," Eleanor said. "That is the heartbeat. If the heartbeat is even, the clock keeps time. If the heartbeat limps, if one side of the swing is just a fraction longer than the other, the clock drifts. You will not see it on the dial for a week, but you will hear it tonight if you know how to listen." She paused. "Can you hear it limping?" Wren listened for what felt like a long time. "No," she said finally. "It sounds even." "Good," Eleanor said. "It is even. This clock is healthy. Now I am going to show you a sick one." She brought a second mantel clock out from the cupboard. Wren pressed her ear to it. The escapement sound was different. The click on one side was by the smallest margin, a little louder, a little later than the click on the other. A tiny asymmetry the size of a held breath. "That one's limping," Wren said. Eleanor looked at her. She did not smile. She did not exclaim. She did not call her granddaughter clever. She only looked at the small girl on the wooden stool with the loop still too large around her neck, and she said the same sentence Mr. Ellsworth had said to her in the spring of 1961. "You have the ear." Wren did not understand at 6 what the sentence meant. She understood it now. The Saturday visits went on for 12 years. Every Saturday, the kitchen bench. Every Saturday, the row of clocks and watches laid out on the felt mat waiting. Every Saturday, Eleanor's hands growing slower and more crooked with each passing year as the arthritis crept up her fingers like a tide, doing the small fine work for as long as her hands could still do it. And then when they could not, sitting back and saying to her granddaughter, "Now you, I will tell you what to do." By the time Wren was 10, she could disassemble a simple mantle clock movement and put it back together without losing a single screw. By 12, she had done her first repair on a customer's piece, a small brass carriage clock that had belonged to a retired professor at Deerfield Academy. The professor had picked it up the following Saturday and had held it to his ear and had said very quietly, "It sounds different. It sounds younger." Eleanor had said, "My granddaughter did the work." The professor had looked at the thin 12-year-old girl sitting on a wooden stool at a kitchen bench with dark hair and serious eyes and a brass loop around her neck, and he had said, "Then I am going to bring you my grandfather clock next month." He did. Wren repaired it. She was 12. By 16, Wren was doing most of the work herself. Eleanor's hands were nearly finished. They could still hold a teacup. They could no longer hold a screwdriver fine enough to engage a 4-millimeter brass screw without slipping off the head. Eleanor had simply moved into the role of teacher full-time. She sat beside Wren at the bench, and she narrated each step in the slow, patient voice of a woman who had performed the same procedure 10,000 times while her granddaughter's young, steady hands carried out the operations her own arthritic hands could no longer perform. The arrangement was for both of them the most natural thing in the world. Eleanor's knowledge lived in her ears and her memory. Wren's skill lived in her hands. Between the two of them, they were one complete repair woman, the way an old married couple is sometimes one complete person. The customers accepted the transition without protest. Mrs. Alderman from Shelburne Falls brought her grandmother's Seth Thomas every January and said every January, "Your hands are steadier than Eleanor's ever were." Eleanor, sitting right there on the kitchen bench, said every year, "That is true." Mr. Hawthorne from Turner's Falls brought his father's railroad pocket watch every March and said every March, "My father would not have let any other person on this earth touch this watch, but he would have let her." By the time Wren was 17, she had begun to understand what the work really was. It was not mechanical, or it was not only mechanical, it was custodial. She was not simply repairing clocks. She was maintaining the relationship between a family and its own history. A clock that had been in a family for 3 generations was not a machine. It was a member of the household. The women who carried their inherited clocks to Eleanor's kitchen bench, wrapped in tea towels tucked into shopping bags, were not asking for a repair. They were asking for a promise. The promise that the clock would continue to keep time for the next generation the way it had kept time for the last. Wren had made that promise silently with every mainspring she wound and every escapement she balanced. The making of that promise had been the closest thing to a vocation she had ever experienced. It had been the closest thing to a home. And then on a Saturday in the spring of 2020, when Wren was 16 and the world was strange because of a virus and the kitchen bench had become the only place in her life that still felt the same, Eleanor told her about Samuel Hartwell. It was an offhand thing. They were working on a Howard banjo clock that had been brought in by a man from Sunderland whose grandfather had bought it new in 1922. Eleanor was watching Wren reseat the pendulum suspension spring. The afternoon was warm. The window over the bench was open, and the smell of lilac was coming in from the side yard. "There used to be 7 clockmakers' shops in this county," Eleanor said. She said it the way an old woman says a thing because she has been thinking about it, and the thought has reached the surface. 7, at the peak of the trade. By the time I started, there were 2. By 1969, there were none. Wren looked up from the bench. What happened to them? What happens to every trade? Time moves, fashions change, battery clocks came in, quartz watches came in. People stopped needing a man who could hear 2 seconds 80. They could buy a wristwatch at the drugstore for $9 that kept time better than anything we could tune by hand. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The last to close was Hartwell's in Montague." "Hartwell," Wren said. "Samuel Hartwell, the last of the real clockmakers in this valley. He could build a clock from raw brass and steel. I could only repair them. There is a difference." Wren waited. "I met him once," Eleanor said, "in 1965. I was 23. Mr. Ellsworth took me to Hartwell's shop one afternoon to learn a particular escapement adjustment that Sam Hartwell knew and we did not. He spent half a day teaching me. He was patient. He was very quiet. He had hands like a surgeon and the kindest eyes I ever saw in a working man. When I thanked him at the end, he said something to me that I have never forgotten. He said, 'You have the ear, Eleanor. Don't let anything take it away from you.'" Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. The hands were swollen at the knuckles. The right thumb did not quite straighten anymore. "He closed his shop in November of 1969, she said. "I was 27. I heard about it from a customer in Greenfield. I meant to drive up to Montague the following week and ask him why. I never went. Walter and I were planning the wedding. There was always going to be time later." She looked out the window at the lilac. "There was no later. I never saw him again. I have wondered every year of my life since what I would have heard him say if I had made that drive." Wren did not answer. She bent back over the Howard banjo clock and continued to work, and she filed the name in the place inside her head where she filed names that mattered without yet knowing why they mattered. Samuel Hartwell, Montague. She would not think of it again for 4 years, but she would not forget it either. Eleanor died in October of 2022 in the way that women like Eleanor, which is to say cleanly and on a workday. It was a Saturday morning. She had been at the kitchen bench since 7 working on a 1940s Elgin pocket watch that belonged to a regular customer from Conway. She was 80 years old. She had that morning complained briefly to no one of a tightness in her chest, and then she had gone back to work because Eleanor Caldwell did not stop work for any reason short of a power outage. The heart attack came at 9:15. What is known as this. Before she died, she set the Elgin pocket watch down on the bench mat with deliberate care in the exact center of the felt, where it could not roll, where it could not be damaged, where it could be found by the next person who came into the kitchen and known immediately to be valuable. She set it down carefully. She did not damage that watch, not even in the last 10 seconds of her life. Wren came over for the regular Saturday visit at 11. She walked into the kitchen with her messenger bag over her shoulder and the loop around her neck. She found her grandmother at the bench. She did not cry, not at first. She did the thing Eleanor had taught her to do. She picked up the Elgin pocket watch. She held it to her ear. It was still running. It was still running perfectly on the energy Eleanor had wound into it that morning at 7. Its tick was even. Both sides of the swing were equal. The watch was healthy. The watch was going to keep time on that single winding for another 26 hours. Wren stood in the kitchen for a long time holding the watch to her ear, listening to the small, steady sound of a thing her grandmother had set in motion at 7 o'clock that would still be in motion at 9 the following morning, and she understood more completely than she had ever understood anything in her short life what her grandmother had spent 33 years doing. Eleanor had spent 33 years pushing small mechanisms forward into a future she would not be there to witness. It was the most useful thing a person could do. Wren took from the house the brass loop on its leather cord, the set of watchmaker's screwdrivers in their wooden case, the tin of watch oil that had sat on Eleanor's kitchen shelf for 30 years, and a single photograph taken in 1974 of Eleanor at the shop bench in Greenfield Loop. In her eye, a pocket watch open on the felt mat in front of her, the kind of photograph that captures a person at the moment of being most herself. The Warrens did not want any of these things. The Warrens lasted 6 months. In March of 2024, on a Wednesday evening that smelled of the first thaw, Beth Warren sat down across from Wren at the kitchen table and told her in the tired voice of a woman who has rehearsed an apology she does not really mean that Whitney Warren, who had been away at college for 2 years, had dropped out and was coming home, and Beth was very sorry, but Whitney was going to need her old room and Wren was going to have to find somewhere else to live. She had 2 weeks. Wren did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She had been the second child in that house for 12 years, and she had always known with a clear, cold knowledge that lived just under her ribs, that second ended on the day first came back. She packed the messenger bag. She took the loop. She took the screwdrivers. She took the photograph of Eleanor in 1974. She took the tin of watch oil. She took $380 in savings accumulated over 2 years of small repair jobs done on the side for Eleanor's old customers who had continued to bring their pieces to Wren after Eleanor's death because there was no one else. She walked out of the Warrens' house on Federal Street on a cold March morning, and she did not look back, and she did not have anywhere to go. She rode the bus to Turner's Falls because the bus went there. 3 days later, on a gray afternoon when her cash was nearly gone and her hands were so cold she could not feel the loop against her chest, Wren Caldwell sat at the counter of a small diner on Avenue A in Turner's Falls, eating a bowl of soup she had paid for with the last of her week's money. She was thinking about nothing in particular. She was thinking about the way the soup steamed against the cold window. She was thinking about whether tomorrow she would walk to the river and whether she would sit on the bank and whether she would pray, even though she did not know how to pray because Eleanor had not been a praying woman and had not taught her. Behind her in the booth against the wall, 2 men were talking. They were both older. One of them was perhaps 70 in a red flannel shirt and gray suspenders, with the weathered face of a man who had spent his working life outdoors. The other was younger, maybe 50, in a denim jacket. They were drinking coffee. They were talking in the slow, looping way that men who have known each other for 40 years talk about nothing important until the older one mentioned in passing an old building on Mill Street up in Montague Center. "Town's been trying to give it away since 2012, he said. "Nobody wants it. Too small for a business. Too old to insure. Roof needs work. Windows been boarded over for years." The Historical Commission threw up its hands. "That the old clockmaker's shop?" the younger man asked. "That's the one. Hartwell's. Closed in '69. Hasn't been open since." The younger man whistled low. 55 years. More than 55. He locked the door in November of '69 and walked the key over to the town clerk's office and put it on the counter and told her to hold it for whoever came next. Old Mrs. Pemberton was the clerk back then. She's been gone 20 years. The new clerk, Rachel Buckley, she still has that key in a drawer, just sitting there. Wren had stopped eating. She sat very still on the counter stool. The soup steamed. The wind pushed against the window of the diner and rattled the loose pane. Behind her, the older man laughed a short, dry laugh. "Town would just about pay you to take it off their hands," he said. $10 and a signature. Whole shop, tools and all. Anyone fool enough to want it. Wren turned around on her stool. She had $4.17 in her pocket. She had in her savings account $340 in change. She had a brass loop around her neck. She had a name in a part of her head she had not visited in 4 years. Samuel Hartwell, Montague. She looked at the old man in the red flannel shirt, and she said very quietly, the way Eleanor used to speak when she was about to ask a question whose answer would change the rest of the day. "Excuse me, sir, where exactly is that shop?" The old man looked at her for a long moment over the rim of his coffee cup. He took in the thin coat, the brass loop, the messenger bag on the stool beside her. He took in perhaps something else as well. Something about the stillness with which she had asked the question. He nodded once slowly as if confirming a thought he had not spoken. "Mill Street Montague Center," he said, "right next to the old Grange Hall. You can't miss it. It's the one with the boarded window and the sign that still says Hartwell." He paused. "You interested, miss?" Wren Caldwell looked down at the soup in front of her. It was nearly cold. The window of the diner shook with the March wind. Somewhere out in the gray afternoon in a town she had never been to, on a street she had never walked, a brass key had been waiting in a drawer for 55 years for someone to come and ask about it. "Yes, sir," she said, "I am." The next morning at the small office of the Montague town clerk, a woman named Rachel Buckley stamped a deed without ceremony, took $10 in cash from a girl she had never seen before, and reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and brought out a heavy brass key on a worn leather fob. She set the key on the counter between them. She did not let go of it right away. "This key is original to the building," Mrs. Buckley said. "Samuel Hartwell's key. He locked the door in November of 1969 and brought it to this office and set it on this counter and told my predecessor, Mrs. Pemberton, to hold it for whoever came next. We have been holding it for 55 years." She looked at Wren over the rim of her glasses. Her eyes were tired and kind. "I guess you're next." She let go of the key. Wren picked it up. The brass was warm from the drawer. The leather of the fob was soft and worn smooth, the way the handle of a tool gets soft when one man's hand has worked it for 35 years. She closed her fingers around it. She could feel faintly the impression of another set of fingers that had worn the metal down before her. She walked out of the clerk's office. The wind off the Connecticut River was sharp. The sky over Montague Center was the color of pewter. She walked 2 blocks east and then 1 block north, and there it was. A narrow clapboard building, 2 stories, built in 1898. The clapboard front had buckled along the sill where rain had gotten under it. The display window had been boarded over with weathered plywood. Above the door, in faded gold lettering that had once been beautiful, the sign still read, "Hartwell Clocks." Wren Caldwell stopped on the sidewalk in front of the door. She was 20 years old. She had 10 fewer dollars than she had owned an hour ago. She had a brass key in her hand that had been waiting in a drawer since the year her grandmother got engaged. She brought the key up to the lock. Her hand was shaking. She did not know yet, standing on that sidewalk on Mill Street, that the lock was going to turn smoothly because Samuel Hartwell had oiled it the morning he closed the shop. She did not know yet that 55 years of stillness were waiting for her on the other side of that door. She did not know yet about the 6 brass screws. She slid the key into the lock. The key turned smoothly. It turned the way a key turns when the lock has been oiled by a man who knew he was leaving and who wanted the next person, whoever they would be, to find the door easy. Samuel Hartwell had put 3 drops of clock oil into that mechanism on the morning of November 11th, 1969, before he had walked the key 2 blocks to the clerk's office. The oil had been doing its quiet work for 55 years. Wren Caldwell pushed the door open. The hinges did not creak. They sighed the way an old man sighs when he sits down at last in his own chair. The door swung inward into a darkness that smelled of dust and old wood and something else. something fainter and harder to name, the ghost of coffee that had been brewed on a small kerosene burner in the back corner of the room a very long time ago. She stepped over the threshold. The afternoon light came in behind her, a pale rectangle on the plank floor. Beyond that rectangle, the room was shadow. Wren stood inside the doorway and did not move for a full minute. She did what Eleanor had taught her to do in old rooms. She waited. Eleanor had told her on a Saturday when she was 9 that every old room had a rhythm of its own, and that a person who walked into an old room talking or moving or turning on lights would never hear that rhythm. The room would be too startled to speak. You had to stand still inside the doorway. You had to let the room understand that you had come quietly and that you had come to listen, and only then would the room begin to tell you what it had been keeping for you. Wren stood inside the doorway. The room was long and narrow, plank floor gone gray with the dust of 2 generations, plaster walls webbed with hairline cracks, a pressed tin ceiling with a stamped floral pattern dim but still legible under 55 years of cobweb. Along the left wall ran a workbench low and broad, with small drawers built into its skirt. Along the right wall, a series of empty shelves, the kind of shelves that had once held finished pieces awaiting pickup. A small kerosene heater in the back corner, a glass-fronted display case beside the boarded window, with one carriage clock visible inside it, dusty but intact. And against the back wall, floor to ceiling, the master regulator. It stood the way a tall man stands when he has been waiting a long time. Mahogany case, deeply red, even through the dust, with a glass door in the front and brass hinges that had blackened with time. White enamel dial, Roman numerals, a long brass pendulum hanging motionless in its case, the bob the size of a man's fist. The hands of the clock were fixed at 4:47 in a position that looked accidental, but Wren would understand later was not. She walked toward it slowly. The plank floor flexed faintly under her boots. Each step she took stirred the dust into a small drifting cloud that hung in the slanting light from the open door. She did not turn on a light. There was no light to turn on. The electric service to the building had been disconnected. Sometime in the 1980s, the town clerk had told her that morning, and would have to be reapplied for at her own expense. She stopped in front of the clock. She set her messenger bag down on the workbench. She took out from inside her coat the brass loop on its leather cord, and she put the cord over her head. She unfolded her grandmother's small set of screwdrivers on the bench beside the bag. She did all of this without thinking, because her hands had done it 10,000 times in Eleanor's kitchen, and her hands knew how to begin. Then she opened the glass door of the regulator. The hinges were stiff. She had to pull gently. The door swung outward and revealed the movement inside. Wren Caldwell stood very still and looked at what she saw. The brass plates of the movement were dark with the grease of 100 years and the dust of 55. The gear train was intact. The escapement was intact. The pendulum hung from its suspension spring motionless and undisturbed, but the mainspring barrel was empty. The barrel was the heart of the clock, the place where the energy lived. A clock without its mainspring was not a clock. It was a sculpture of a clock. The barrel had been removed, and not by accident. The arbor was clean. The retaining clip was missing. Whoever had taken out that mainspring had done so on purpose, with care, with the gentleness of a surgeon removing a heart from a body he intended to bury. Wren stood there for a long time and looked at the empty barrel. In her chest, something was turning here. Not panic, not disappointment. Something older than both. The same feeling Eleanor had described to her once on a long afternoon at the kitchen bench, when she said, "Sometimes you open a clock and you find that the last person who worked on it was telling you something." Listen, always listen for what they were telling you. The empty barrel was telling her something. She whispered to no one in particular in the gray light of the still room, "Who are you? What did you do?" The room did not answer. Not yet. She stepped back from the clock. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the workbench, the shelves, the small heater, the glass display case. She walked over to the workbench and she pulled open the small drawers one at a time. And what she found in them was the second thing she would never forget about that afternoon. Every tool was where it should be. Tweezers in the tweezer drawer. Mainspring winders in a graduated set from smallest to largest in their wooden tray. Screwdrivers sorted by blade width in a felt-lined slot. A complete set of pivot files. A small brass bench vise. A staking set. 2 horsehair brushes, one for benzene and one for oil, hung on a tiny brass hook that someone had screwed into the underside of the bench. A bottle of clock oil dried to a thin amber crust at the bottom but still present. The drawers had not been emptied. The drawers had been left. Whoever had closed this shop had not abandoned it. He had set it down the way a man sets down a watch on a felt mat, in the exact center where it could not roll, where it could not be damaged, where it could be found. Wren stood at the workbench in the dust, and she remembered all at once, and very clearly, a thing her grandmother had said 4 years earlier in the lilac-smelling kitchen on a Saturday afternoon. Eleanor had said, "He had hands like a surgeon and the kindest eyes I ever saw on a working man." She had said, "I never saw him again. I have wondered every year of my life since what I would have heard him say if I had made that drive." Samuel Hartwell. Wren spoke the name out loud in the empty shop for the first time. The name sat in the air like a small object placed on a clean table. "Mr. Hartwell." She walked back across the room to the master regulator. She crouched beside it. She set her hand on the side of the case. The mahogany was cool and smooth under her palm, the way a horse's neck is cool and smooth when it has been standing in the shade. She said very quietly, "Why is your spring missing?" Then she stood up and she did what Eleanor had taught her to do when her ears could not answer a question. She let her eyes try. She walked slowly around the clock. She bent at the waist and looked at the case from below. She straightened and looked at the case from above. She walked behind the clock into the narrow space between the case and the back wall of the shop, and she crouched down again, and she shone the small flashlight she had taken from her messenger bag onto the rear panel of the clock. She saw it almost immediately. 6 brass screws. They were holding the rear panel of the case in place. There was nothing unusual by itself about 6 brass screws holding a rear panel. What was unusual was their color. The screws were bright, not new, but bright. The brass had only the faint patina of 50-some years of indoor air. It had not blackened. It had not corroded. It had not aged the way the brass on the rest of the clock had aged across 126 years of standing in this room. These 6 screws were not original to the case. They had been put in later. They had been put in, Wren understood, with the particular clarity of a person who had been trained from the age of 6 to read the small evidence of human intention by a man who wanted that panel to come off again someday. He had used new screws because he had wanted whoever came next to see them. He had wanted them to be visible. He had been leaving a sign. Wren reached over to the bench. From the 3rd drawer down, she selected one of Samuel Hartwell's own brass-handled screwdrivers, the size that fit a 6mm brass slot screw. The handle was the color of honey. It had been handled by a man's right hand for a very long time. There was a faint thumbprint worn into the wood just below the ferrule. She placed her own thumb in that worn place. It fit. Her hand began to shake. She closed her eyes for a moment and made it stop. She brought the screwdriver to the first screw and she set the blade into the slot and she turned. The screw came out smoothly. It dropped into her open palm with a small dry weight. She set it on the floor beside her knee. She moved to the second screw. The second screw came out. The third, the fourth, the fifth. Her breath was very shallow now. The shop was very quiet. Outside on Mill Street, the wind was rising. She could hear it in the bare branches of the maple at the corner. She could hear from somewhere far away the bell of the Congregational church marking the half hour. She turned the sixth screw. It came free. The rear panel of the master regulator, an inch and a half of solid mahogany that had been in place since the year Richard Nixon was sworn in, sagged forward under its own weight by perhaps a quarter of an inch. Wren caught it with her left hand. She lifted it gently away from the case and laid it down on the floor beside her. Behind the panel, in a recessed cavity between the inside of the clock case and the lath and plaster of the back wall of the shop, three things were resting: a coiled mainspring in a brass barrel, the mainspring of the master regulator, the heart Samuel Hartwell had taken out of his clock on the afternoon of November 11th, 1969, a heavy canvas pouch the size of a man's two fists put together. The pouch had a drawstring of brown twine. Through the canvas faintly, Wren could feel small round shapes stacked. And on top of both, a folded letter in a cream-colored envelope sealed with a small dab of red wax. The envelope had no name on it. Or rather, the envelope had every name on it. The envelope had been left for a person whose identity Samuel Hartwell could not have known, and whose existence he had had no proof of, and whom he had nonetheless trusted to come. Wren Caldwell, who had been homeless for 15 days and who had 10 fewer dollars than she had owned that morning, sat down on the plank floor of the shop she now owned with her back against the cold case of the master regulator, and she took the envelope into her hands. She broke the wax with her thumbnail. She unfolded the letter. The paper had aged to the color of old tea. The handwriting was deliberate and square, the hand of a man who had not written many letters in his life, and who had taken pains with this one. The ink had faded to a soft brown. She held the page up to the slanting light from the open door, and she began to read. To whoever finds this spring. My name is Samuel Hartwell. I have repaired and maintained the clocks of this valley from my father's bench since 1934, and from my own bench after he passed. Today is the 11th of November, 1969. I am 67 years old. I am closing this shop today not because I want to, but because the world has decided that my trade is no longer needed. The battery clock has come. The quartz watch is coming. People will still need to know the time. They will not need a man who can hear the difference between 2 seconds and 4. I am not bitter about this. 35 years is a good run for any trade. My father gave me 35 years. I do not ask for more. But there is one thing I cannot do. I cannot sell this clock. My father set it into this room in 1898. It has stood here for 71 years. It has measured the hours for every family in this valley. To sell it to a collector would be to turn it into a piece of furniture. So I am taking out its mainspring. The mainspring is the clock. Without the spring, it is furniture. With the spring, it is alive. I am leaving the spring for the person who knows the difference. The gold in this pouch is what I have saved across 35 years of working life. It is now yours. Use it to reopen the shop, or use it to go somewhere else. I do not mind. I am trusting you. The tools in the workbench are yours. My father taught me that a tool out of place is a tool that has died. I have kept these tools alive. I have left them where they belong. A clockmaker's shop without a clockmaker is a room full of silence. The silence is not empty. The silence is waiting. Wind the spring. Start the clock. Samuel Hartwell, clockmaker. The 11th of November, 1969. Wren read the letter once. She read it again. She did not cry the first time. She cried the second time, and the crying was silent, and it did not last long because she had been raised by a woman who had not been a crier, and because her hands were doing something else. Her hands had picked up the brass barrel from the wall cavity and were holding it against her chest the way a woman holds a sleeping infant. The brass was cold. The mainspring inside the barrel was perfectly silent. A mainspring makes no sound until it is installed in a clock. But Wren could feel through the metal the faint promise of stored potential. The spring had been wound to its halfway point on the day Samuel Hartwell had sealed it into the wall, and it had been waiting under the slow tension of its own coiled steel ever since. She whispered into the still air of the shop, into the dust and the slanting light and the silence of 55 years. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. I will wind the spring." She would learn much later the day Samuel Hartwell had spent before he wrote that letter. She would not learn it from any document. She would not learn it from any photograph. There was no one alive to tell it to her in the form that mattered. But she would come to understand it the way clockmakers come to understand the mind of the man who built the movement they are repairing by the pattern of the work he had left behind. The pattern of November 11th, 1969 was this. Samuel Hartwell had risen at 6. He had been rising at 6 every morning for 35 years, and on the last day he did not change his habit. He had brewed coffee on the small kerosene burner in the back of the shop, and he had drunk it in silence, standing at the front window, looking out through the wavy old glass at the empty mill street, where in better years the milk truck would have already gone by. At 7:15 he had wound every clock in the shop. He had wound them in the order he always wound them. He had wound the master regulator first. He had wound the carriage clocks next. He had wound the wall clocks and above the workbench. And last he had wound with an old worn brass key his father's Hamilton Railroad pocket. Watch the watch Henry Hartwell had given to Samuel in 1934. On the morning Henry had handed him the shop, with the only piece of advice the older man had ever given him about the trade. Henry had said, "This watch stops, the shop stops. Wind it every morning." Samuel had wound it every morning at 7:15 for 35 years. He wound it on the morning of November 11th, 1969. At 9, a woman had come in, Mrs. Whitman from Northfield, 81 years old, a regular customer for 40 years. She did not know that today was the last day. She brought him a small French carriage clock that had belonged to her mother. The mainspring had snapped. She set it on the counter and asked him whether it could be repaired. He said yes. He wrote out a ticket. He told her 2 weeks. She thanked him and left. He stood at the counter after she had gone, holding the ticket in his hand. He knew he was not going to repair her mother's clock. He went to the back of the shop. He unlocked the glass display case beside the boarded window. He set the carriage clock inside it on the middle shelf in a place where it could be seen from the street. He went back to the counter, and in the leather-bound shop ledger, he wrote in his deliberate hand a single line beneath Mrs. Whitman's name. "For the next person." At 11, he began the letter. He wrote 3 drafts. The first draft was too long. The second draft was too cold. The third draft was the one he sealed into the wall. He used the fountain pen his wife Clara had given him for their 20th anniversary. Clara had been gone 2 years by then, taken by a cancer that had moved through her like weather, and the pen was one of the few objects in the shop that Samuel still touched with a particular tenderness. When he finished writing, he read the letter through once. He folded it. He sealed it with red wax. He did not put a name on the envelope because there was no name to put. At noon, he ate his lunch, a roast beef sandwich on white bread made that morning at home, the way Clara had made his sandwiches for 21 years with butter and a smear of horseradish. He had been making them for himself since she died. He ate it slowly, sitting on the stool at the workbench, looking at the master regulator at the back of the shop, listening to its tick. He listened to the tick for a long time. Then he stood up. At 1 o'clock, Samuel Hartwell did the hardest thing he had done in 35 years of clockmaking. He took the mainspring out of the master regulator. He did it with a brass-handled screwdriver, the same one that Wren Caldwell would, 55 years later, find in the third drawer of the workbench and pick up with her own thumb, fitting into the worn place where his thumb had been. He removed the access plate of the case. He removed the click spring. He let down the pressure on the mainspring slowly, 1/4 turn of the winding key at a time, so that the spring would not snap or jolt or damage itself in the unwinding. He removed the barrel from its arbor. He had to stop 3 times. He had to stop because his hands were shaking and because he had not cried in front of any person in his life, not at his father's funeral in 1934, not at his daughter's leaving in 1966, not at his wife's bedside in 1967, but he had to stop and sit down on the stool at the workbench while his hands shook because what he was doing was the closest thing to grief his body had ever carried. When the barrel was free, he held it in both hands against his chest the way a man holds a sleeping child he has carried up the stairs. He brought it to the wall cavity behind the case. He laid it gently into the cavity. He laid the canvas pouch of 41 Liberty Quarter Eagles beside it. He had been saving those coins 1 or 2 a year since 1934. He had bought them with what he had been able to spare from each year's earnings against the way which his father had warned him would come when paper money might mean nothing. He laid the letter on top of the spring. He fitted the rear panel into place. He took 6 new brass screws which he had purchased the previous Tuesday at the hardware store across the street that belonged to his oldest friend, Thomas Riley, and he drove them into the panel with deliberate care. He used new screws because he wanted them to be visible. He wanted the next person, whoever they would be, to see at a glance that something had been done here. He wanted the panel to come off again easily when its time came. At 3:30, he swept the floor. He swept it from the front of the shop to the back, the way his father had taught him to sweep it in 1934 on Samuel's first day. He swept the dust out the front door and into Mill Street, and he closed the door behind him. He returned every tool to its place in the workbench drawers. He did not take a single one home. He had told the truth in the letter. The tools belonged to the shop. The tools belonged to whoever came next. At 4:47, the master regulator stopped. It stopped because the residual swing of the pendulum with no spring to drive it ran down at last. He stood in front of the clock and watched the pendulum slow and slow and slow and finally come to rest in dead center. The second hand stopped between the 8 and the 9. The minute hand stopped at 4:47. He did not move the hands. He let the clock stop where the clock had decided to stop. At 5 o'clock, he put on his coat. He turned out the kerosene heater. He stood in the doorway of the shop for a long moment and looked back at the room he had walked into every working day for 35 years. The light from the boarded window was gone. The shop was almost dark. The master regulator stood at the back wall in silence. He said to the room in a voice no other person heard, "I'll be seeing you." Then he closed the door and he locked it with the brass key, and he walked the 2 blocks to the office of the town clerk. The clerk in 1969 was a woman named Frances Pemberton. She was 50 years old. She had known Samuel for 30 years. She had brought him her mother's wristwatch in 1948 and her son's first pocket watch in 1962, and Samuel had repaired both for less than the work was worth because that was the kind of man he was. When he came in that afternoon and set the brass key on the counter and pushed it across, she did not at first understand what he was doing. She said, "Sam, what's this?" He said, "Closing the shop today, Francis." Today. She looked at the key, she looked at his face. She had known him long enough to know that there was no point in talking him out of it. She said more quietly, "Who's the key for Sam?" He thought about her question for a moment. Then he said the only true answer he had, "For whoever comes next." "Sam," she said, "who's coming?" "I don't know, Francis. Someone will. Maybe in a year, maybe in 50. I don't get to know. My job is to leave it ready." Ready for what? He looked at her, and she would remember for the rest of her life the expression on his face. It was not the expression of a man giving up. It was the expression of a man making a delivery, the expression of a man who had carried a parcel a long way and was now setting it down on the counter, and who could already feel the weight of it lifting from his shoulders. He said, "Ready for the person who will know the difference between a clock and a piece of furniture." Frances Pemberton put the brass key into the bottom drawer of her desk, and she locked the drawer, and she did not take that key out again for the next 38 years of her working life. When she retired in 2007, she handed the key in the same drawer to a young woman named Rachel Buckley, who had just been hired as her replacement. Mrs. Pemberton said on her last day, "There is a key in the bottom drawer. It belongs to the old Hartwell shop on Mill Street. Sam Hartwell left it here in 1969 for whoever came next. We have not yet had anyone come next. Do not throw that key away. Do not give it to a contractor. Do not give it to the Historical Commission. Hold it until the right person asks for it. You will know when she comes that she is the one. Do you understand?" Rachel Buckley said yes. Miss Pemberton said, "Good, Erstein," and went home and lived another 9 years and died in her sleep on a Sunday morning, having never spoken of the key to anyone else. Rachel Buckley held the key for 17 years. She held it in that bottom drawer through 3 town managers and 2 renovations of the clerk's office and 1 fire that nearly took the whole building. She held it through 55 total years of waiting. And then, on a cold March morning in 2024, a thin 20-year-old girl with a brass loop around her neck and a messenger bag over her shoulder walked into the office and said very quietly that she would like to know about an old clockmaker's shop on Mill Street. Mrs. Buckley reached into the bottom drawer. She did not need to ask the girl any questions. Mrs. Pemberton had told her that she would know. Mrs. Pemberton had been right. Wren did not know that afternoon sitting on the plank floor, with her back against the master regulator and the letter in her hand, any of these things. She did not know about Mrs. Whitman or about Frances Pemberton. She did not know about the drafts of the letter. She did not know about the lunch. She knew only what was in front of her: the spring, the pouch, the page of brown ink. She refolded the letter. She placed it carefully on the workbench in the exact center on a clean spot of felt that she wiped first with the corner of her sleeve. She picked up the canvas pouch. She loosened the drawstring. She poured a small handful of the contents into her palm. 41 gold coins, Liberty Quarter Eagles. The dates range from 1901 to 1968. A man's working life expressed in metal. She looked at the gold for a long time. She did not think about money. She thought about the years. Each coin was a year. Each coin was a Tuesday in some November, When Samuel Hartwell had walked to the bank in Greenfield and exchanged a portion of his earnings for a small, dense disc of metal he had then carried home and placed in a pouch in a drawer in his workbench, because his father had told him in 1934 that a wise man kept some part of his savings in a form that could not be inflated away. She poured the coins back into the pouch. She drew the string tight. She set the pouch on the workbench beside the letter. Then she turned and looked at the master regulator. She said to the silent clock in a voice that was very steady, the voice of a young woman who has just been given a charge by a man she will never meet. "I am going to wind your spring, Mr. Hartwell. It is going to take me a while, but I am going to do it." She did not start that night. She did not have the tools she needed. She did not have the cleaning solvent. She did not have the oil. She did not have the strength left in her hands after the day she had had to do work that demanded a steady hand. She had learned from Eleanor that a clockmaker who tried to work tired ruined more than she fixed. She stood up from the floor. She picked up her messenger bag. She put the loop back inside her coat. She left the letter in the pouch and the brass barrel on the workbench in the center, and she walked to the front of the shop, and she closed the door behind her, and she locked it with Samuel Hartwell's brass key. She slept that night in the cab of a 2005 Chevy S10 pickup truck she had purchased the next morning with $2,200 from the gold coin proceeds from a retired letter carrier in Montague who had advertised the truck on a piece of cardboard taped to a tree at the edge of town. She slept under her coat. She slept with the brass key in her hand on her chest where she could feel it. In the morning, she would begin. In the morning, she would find Mr. Linden, the coin dealer in Greenfield, and she would receive $23,800 for the gold, and she would deposit it in a savings account at the small bank on Avenue A in Turner's Falls, and she would begin to plan how to spend it slowly and carefully the way Samuel Hartwell would have wanted her to spend it. She would buy a folding army cot from the Salvation Army for $15. She would buy a wool blanket for $8. She would buy a 2-burner camp stove. She would buy plaster and a trowel and a horsehair brush and benzene and a bottle of fresh clock oil, although she had her grandmother's old tin and would use it first out of love. In the morning, the work would begin. But for that one night in the cab of a truck that smelled of motor oil and old upholstery in a parking lot behind the hardware store on Avenue A, with the wind coming down off the Berkshires and rattling the loose plastic of the dashboard, Ren Caldwell lay very still and listened to the silence, and thought about a man she had never met, who had sat down at a workbench 55 years ago and written a letter to her before she had been born, before her grandmother had been married, before her father had been conceived, and who had trusted her with no proof that she existed to come. She thought about what kind of man does that. She thought about what kind of man sits alone in an empty shop on the last afternoon of his working life and takes the heart out of his own clock with his own hands and seals it into a wall and walks away because he believes against all available evidence that a person will come. She thought for the first time in her life that she might know what kind of man. She fell asleep with the brass key over her heart, and she slept for the first time in 15 days all the way through the night. The first morning of work began at 6. Ren Caldwell rose in the cab of the truck before the sun was up over the ridgeline of the Berkshires in the cold blue hour, when the river fog still hung low over the Connecticut and the street lights of Avenue A had not yet clicked off. She drank coffee from a paper cup at the diner. She walked the half-mile to the shop. She unlocked the door with the brass key. She stepped inside. The shop was as she had left it, the letter on the workbench exactly centered, the canvas pouch beside it drawstring drawn, the brass barrel of the mainspring resting where she had set it down. The empty cavity behind the master regulator, the rear panel propped against the wall, the 6 brass screws lined up on the floor in the order in which she had removed them. She stood in the doorway and let the room understand that she had come back. Then she set down her bag, and she put on the loop, and she began. The work would take 5 weeks. In the first week, she did not touch the master regulator at all. She cleaned. She swept the plank floor with a broom she had bought for $9 at the hardware store across the street, the same hardware store that had in 1969 sold Samuel Hartwell 6 new brass screws on a Tuesday afternoon. The current owner of that store, a man in his early 60s, watched her from his front window and did not yet come over. He had heard from Mrs. Buckley that someone had bought the Hartwell building. He had heard the someone was a young woman. He was not yet ready to walk across the street and find out for himself. Some things he had learned in 63 years of life in a small town deserved to be approached the way a man approaches a deer in a clearing, slowly, with the wind in his face. Wren swept. She wiped the workbench down with a rag dampened in vinegar. She washed the inside of the front window behind the boarded plywood until the wavy old glass was clean. She did not yet remove the plywood. The plywood was protecting her. She was not ready to be seen. In the second week, she patched the walls. She had checked out a book from the Greenfield Public Library on the repair of historic plaster, and she had read it twice, and on a Tuesday morning, she mixed her first batch of patching plaster in a tin bucket on the shop floor, kneeling with a flat trowel in her right hand and a sponge in her left. The first patch she made was too thick. It cracked while it dried, and she scraped it out with a putty knife and started again. The second patch held. By Friday, she had patched every hairline in the front room, and the walls were smooth and pale, and the pressed tin ceiling above them looked sharper than it had since the Eisenhower administration, the stamped floral pattern visible for the first time in decades. Mrs. Buckley came on the third Saturday. She came in a cardigan and sensible shoes carrying a cardboard box, and she did not knock. She pushed the door open with her hip the way a woman pushes open the door of her own kitchen. She set the box down on the workbench. "I am not," she said, "going to have Sam Hartwell's successor starve to death in his own shop. He would haunt me. He would haunt you too, and he would be right too. Here is a coffee pot. Here is a cast iron skillet. Here are 2 plates, 2 mugs, a fork, a knife, a spoon, and a paring knife. Here is a bag of groceries." Rachel Buckley, the town clerk, who is 58 years old and has her own opinions about what a young woman needs in a kitchen. You can disagree with me later. For now, you can eat. Wren did not know what to say. Mrs. Buckley looked at her and her face softened. "Sit down, child. Drink some coffee. I want to tell you something." They sat. Mrs. Buckley poured the coffee from a thermos she had brought. The thermos coffee was better than the diner coffee. They drank it in silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Buckley spoke. "I met Samuel Hartwell once. I was 22 years old. I had just been hired at the clerk's office. My grandfather had died the month before, and he had left me a small silver pocket watch that he had carried for 40 years, and the watch had stopped on the day of his funeral. I do not know if you believe in such things. I am not sure I do either, but the watch had stopped that day and I could not bear it. I drove up to Mill Street with the watch in my purse, and I knocked on Mr. Hartwell's door, and I asked him if he could fix it." She paused. "He took the watch. He sat down at his workbench. He took out his loop, and he opened the case, and he looked inside for perhaps a minute. Then he looked up at me, and he said in the gentlest voice I have ever heard that the watch had been keeping perfect time and only needed to be wound. He showed me how to wind it. He would not take any money. He said the watch had been waiting for me and that it was mine now and that I was to keep it running. Mrs. Buckley reached into the breast pocket of her cardigan. She drew out a small silver pocket watch on a thin chain and she set it on the workbench between them. I have wound this watch every morning for 36 years, she said. It has not stopped once. Wren picked up the watch. She held it to her ear. The tick was even. Both sides of the swing were equal. She set it down very gently and slid it back across the bench. Mrs. Buckley smiled at her, and her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. Women like Mrs. Buckley did not cry over coffee on a Saturday morning. She put the watch back into her pocket. She stood up. She picked up her empty thermos. I will see you next Saturday, she said. I will bring you something useful. I do not yet know what. She came back the following Saturday with a small bookshelf her husband, she said, was going to throw out. She came every Saturday after that for the rest of the spring and the summer and the fall and into the winter, and she always brought something. A bag of apples from her own tree, a pair of work gloves, a box of tea, a wool sweater, a small electric lamp with a green glass shade because the electrician had finally come and turned the power on in the shop, and Mrs. Buckley said it was uncivilized to do fine work under a bare bulb. She never stayed long. She drank her coffee. She listened when the master regulator was running again to its tick. She said, "It sounds right." She left. By the third week, Wren was inside the master regulator. She had laid the movement out on a clean linen cloth on the workbench, plate by plate, pivot by pivot, wheel by wheel. She had cleaned every part in benzene with the small horsehair brush from Samuel's drawer, the brush that had been waiting in its slot for 55 years and had come back to life in her hand the first time she dipped it into solvent. She had inspected the mainspring itself, uncoiling it carefully on the bench, looking along its length for the hairline fatigue cracks that would mean it had to be replaced. There were no cracks. The spring was sound. The spring had been wound to its midpoint on November 11th, 1969, and held there in stillness in the wall for 55 years. It was tired, but it was not broken. She reseated the spring in its barrel. She seated the barrel on its arbor. She hooked the inner end of the spring to the winding post. She engaged the click spring. She replaced the barrel bridge and the mainspring bridge. She oiled the pivots, 1 drop each, with the watch oil from Eleanor's tin, the same oil that had been on the kitchen shelf in Greenfield for 30 years, the same oil her grandmother had used on the last clock she had ever repaired. By Friday of the third week, the movement was clean and assembled and ready. The pendulum was hung, the case was closed. The clock was in every visible respect restored. She wound it. The mainspring took the wind. The gear train engaged. The escapement began to tick. It ticked for 47 seconds. Then it stopped. She tried again. 30 seconds. Stop. 12 seconds. Stop. She took the movement out of the case again. She laid it on the linen cloth. She inspected every pivot under the loop. She inspected the escapement. She checked the depthing of the wheel teeth. She checked the suspension spring. She found nothing. She put it back together. She wound it. 8 seconds. Stop. By 2 o'clock in the morning of what should have been her last night of work, Wren Caldwell sat on the plank floor of the shop with her back against the master regulator, and she cried. She cried the way she had not cried since the morning she had walked out of the Warrens' house. She cried because she had spent 15 days on this clock, and the clock would not run for 1 full minute. And because she had spent $20,000 of Samuel Hartwell's gold on a building that might not in the end become a shop, And because she was 20 years old and she was alone and she had begun for the first time to wonder whether her grandmother had been wrong. She wondered in the dark whether the ear had been a kindness Eleanor had told her about, because Eleanor had loved her. She wondered whether the customers who had said all those years that her hands were steadier than Eleanor's had been telling her the truth or telling an old woman a kind thing in front of her granddaughter. She wondered whether she was going to have to leave the shop. She wondered where she would go. She thought about the truck. She thought about driving west. She thought about Pittsfield and Albany and beyond. Albany, the long, flat highway that would take her into a country where no one knew her name. She thought about leaving the brass key on the workbench for whoever came after her, and she thought about how that would be a betrayal not just of Samuel Hartwell, but of her grandmother and of the small girl she had been at 6 on the kitchen stool the day Eleanor had said, "You have the ear." She sat on the floor and she cried, and the shop was silent, and her hands hung limp at her sides, and she was as low in that moment as she had ever been in her life. And then she did the last thing that she could think of to do. She pressed her ear very carefully against the wooden case of the master regulator. In the silence of the dead clock, she listened. She listened the way Eleanor had taught her at 6 years old on a kitchen bench in Greenfield. She listened past the silence. She listened for what was supposed to be there. And for a moment, a faint moment, a moment, she would later be unable to describe to any other person because there was no language for it. She heard a thing. It was not a sound. It was the absence of a sound. It was the shape in the silence of where the tick should have been. It was the way the air in the case held itself, the small particular hush of an escapement that wanted to swing and could not because something was by a fraction of a millimeter in the wrong place. She pulled her head back. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She got up off the floor. She went to the workbench. She opened the third drawer. She took out the tray of small files. Beneath the tray at the bottom of the drawer was a thing she had noticed on her first morning and had not yet looked at. It was a leather-bound notebook. It was small, the size of a man's palm. The leather was worn dark at the corners. She had assumed it was empty. She picked it up now in the lamplight, and she opened it. It was not empty. It was Samuel Hartwell's bench notebook. The handwriting was the same hand that had written the letter. The dates ran from 1934 to 1969. It was Wren saw with a slow gathering clarity, a record of every adjustment Samuel had ever made to the master regulator. A clock journal, a diary kept by a man who had loved a clock for 35 years and had wanted to remember everything he had learned about it. She turned the pages. The early entries were in a younger man's hand. They recorded routine winding, oiling the replacement of a pivot in 1941, a cleaning in 1948. The middle entries grew longer. Samuel had begun by 1952 to write small notes about the clock's behavior. The clock ran fast in the heat of August. The clock ran slow in February. The pendulum suspension spring had been replaced in 1956 and had needed a particular adjustment afterward. She turned to the last entries. The very last entry was dated November 10th, 1969. The day before he had closed the shop. It read in his deliberate square hand the writing of a man who knew that he was leaving and who was making one last attempt to leave a map. To whoever serves this clock after me. The palate on the third tooth has over 35 years taken a wear pattern that is unique to the way I tilt my head when I listen. The escapement requires a left-hand bias of approximately 0.2 of a millimeter to compensate. Without this bias, the escapement will appear to be properly seated, and the clock will refuse to run for more than a few seconds. Apply the bias. The clock will then run for another generation. Wren read the entry twice. She laughed once a single broken sound, and tears came to her eyes again. But this time they were not tears of grief. They were tears of being seen. Samuel Hartwell had reached forward through 55 years of silence and had set his hand on her shoulder and had said, "Here is the thing you do not yet know. Here is the small private thing that I alone knew about this clock and that I am giving you now." She took the movement apart again. She found the palette on the third tooth. She found the wear pattern faint but unmistakable under the loop. She took the smallest Arkansas oil stone from Samuel's drawer, and she trued the palette face working by feel and by the angle Samuel had described, and she applied the left-hand bias of 0.2 of a millimeter, and she put the movement back together. She wound the spring. She set the pendulum swinging. The clock ticked. It ticked for 10 seconds, 30, a minute, 2 minutes, 5. It did not stop. The sound filled the shop, a steady, even unhurried tick. The kind of tick a master regulator is meant to make. The kind of tick that travels into the plaster walls and the plank floor and the pressed tin ceiling and settles there and does not leave. The shop, which had been silent for 55 years, was no longer silent. Outside on Mill Street, the false dawn was just beginning. Wren Caldwell stood in the middle of the room with her hand pressed against the case of the master regulator and listened to the tick fill the air around her, and she did not say anything because there was nothing to say. After a long time, she turned and looked at the workbench. Samuel Hartwell's letter was still there in the center where she had left it 5 weeks before. She walked over and picked it up. She held it for a moment. Then she folded it back along its original creases, and she opened the small drawer at the bottom of the workbench, and she laid the letter inside on top of the bench notebook, where it would be safe and where it would be found again by whoever came after her in some year she could not yet imagine. She closed the drawer. She went home to the back of the shop where the army cot waited, and she lay down on the cot in her work clothes, and she fell asleep to the sound of the clock she had brought back to life. In the weeks that followed, the customers came. The first was Mrs. Coleman, a retired schoolteacher from Deerfield, who had heard from Mrs. Buckley that the Hartwell shop was open again. She brought a mantel clock that had belonged to her mother that had not run in 6 years. The mainspring was broken. Wren replaced it in 2 days. When Mrs. Coleman came to pick it up, she held the clock against her ear, and she closed her eyes, and she said in a voice softer than any voice she had used in the shop before that moment, "It sounds right." It was the highest compliment Eleanor had ever taught Wren to listen for. Wren did not say so. She only nodded. The second was Mr. Pell, a dairy farmer from Gill, who came in a barn coat and brought a pocket watch that had been in a drawer for 20 years. His father had carried it for 40 years before that. He wanted his grandson to have it when the boy graduated high school in May. Wren cleaned the movement, replaced the crystal, and adjusted the escapement. Mr. Pell paid her $120 in a live laying hen in a wire crate. He set the crate on the workbench and looked at her gravely. "I do not know if you eat meat," he said. "I do not know if you keep birds. But I thank a person according to my own customs, and my customs include a hen. Her name is Doris. She is a good layer." Wren accepted the hen. She kept her behind the shop in a small fenced run she built that weekend out of scrap lumber, and Doris produced an egg every morning for the next 3 years. The third customer was the retired Deerfield Academy professor, the man whose carriage clock Wren had repaired when she was 12 on a Saturday in Eleanor's kitchen. He came on a Tuesday afternoon in May. He was 81 years old now. He set a pocket watch on the workbench, a Hamilton Railroad grade timepiece that had belonged to his father, and he looked at her over the rim of his glasses and said, I have been waiting, my dear, for you to have a shop. I knew you would. I have been keeping this watch in a drawer for 9 years for this day. She fixed it that afternoon. He told his colleagues at the academy. They told their friends. By June, Wren had work for 4 months out. In July, a man named Edward Thorne drove down from Deerfield in an old BMW and parked outside the shop and stood in the doorway for a full minute, listening to the master regulator tick before he spoke. He was 58 years old. He owned a clock restoration workshop in Deerfield, the only serious one in western Massachusetts. He had heard about Wren from the professor. He said without preamble, "Who taught you?" She said, "My grandmother, Eleanor Caldwell." "Who taught her?" "A man named Mr. Ellsworth." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I knew Lyman Ellsworth." He could hear a hairspring vibrating from across a room. "If you are his lineage, you start work for me on Monday. 2 days a week. I will pay you what the work is worth." She started Monday. She worked for him every Monday and Tuesday from that summer forward, and she did her own shop work the rest of the week. On the first Monday, as she was leaving his workshop in the late afternoon, Edward Thorne stopped her at the door. He said, "You sign your work as Hartwell and Caldwell." "Yes, sir." "I met Sam Hartwell once in 1968. I was 19. I had just started my apprenticeship in Springfield, and I drove up to Montague to ask him if he would take me on as a student. He turned me away. He said the trade was dying and he could not in good conscience take a young man's years for a craft that was ending. But he bought me a cup of coffee at the diner across the street, and he sat with me for an hour, and he told me where I might apprentice instead. He paid for the coffee. He said, 'You will find the trade somewhere else, son.' And I did. I have been waiting 56 years to thank him." He looked at her. "Will you tell him for me, Wren, the next time you are alone in your shop? Will you say that Eddie Thorne sends his thanks?" She said yes. She drove back to Montague with her hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel, and that night alone in the shop with the master regulator ticking, she said it out loud. She said, "Mr. Hartwell, Eddie Thorne sends his thanks." She did not feel foolish. She felt like a woman delivering a letter. In August, on a Saturday afternoon, the door of the shop opened and an older woman walked in. She was 76 years old. She was in a wool coat the color of slate. She was carrying a small carriage clock, wrapped in a flannel cloth in a canvas bag against her chest. She set the bag down on the workbench. She did not introduce herself. She looked instead around the room, slowly. Her eyes moved across the workbench, the shelves, the master regulator, the small green-shaded lamp Mrs. Buckley had brought, the row of customer clocks awaiting work. Her eyes filled, and she made no move to wipe them. She said in a voice that was steady but not certain, "I have not stood in this room since the summer I was 14 years old, the summer of 1962. Wren went very still. The older woman turned to her. "My name is Margaret Hartwell. I am Samuel Hartwell's daughter." Wren put down the loop. She gestured to the visitor's stool by the bench, the one Mrs. Buckley sat on when she came. Margaret Hartwell sat. She did not unwrap the carriage clock. She folded her hands in her lap. She began slowly to speak. "In the summer of 1962, I was 14. My father wanted to teach me his trade. He did not say so directly. He simply sat me down at the bench every Saturday, and he put work in front of me, and he told me what to do, and he watched. I tried. I tried as hard as I have ever tried at anything. I had good hands. I had patience. I had a head for it, but I did not have the ear. I could hear the tick. I could not hear the limp. And by the end of the summer, he had stopped giving me work, and I knew. He never said it. He did not have to." She paused. In 1965, when I was 17, I bought a cheap electric watch at a department store in Holyoke, and I came home and I held it up to him and I said, "Father, this one never needs to be wound." I thought I was teasing. I was not teasing. I was punishing him. I have known that for 60 years. I left Montague in 1966 and I went to Worcester and I trained as a nurse. I came back for my mother's funeral in 1967. My father worked through that funeral. I thought he did not love her. I have since understood that the bench was the only place he knew how to be. I did not understand it then. I held it against him for many years. My father died in 1976. I came home to settle his affairs. I went to find the key to this shop and I could not find it. I went to the town clerk, who at that time was Mrs. Pemberton, and she told me that my father had left the key for whoever came next and that whoever was it was not me. I was 28 years old. I was angry. I stayed angry for a long time. She drew a breath. She reached into the inside pocket of the wool coat. She brought out an envelope yellowed with age, the flaps soft from having been opened and refolded many times. In my father's will, there was a separate letter for me. I am going to read it to you. She unfolded the page. Her hands were old hands, blue-veined and careful, but the hands did not shake. She read, "Not shake. Margaret, my dear daughter, there is something in the shop I have hidden for the person who will come. I know that you have wanted for many years to be that person. I am sorry, I cannot give you the shop. The shop will die in your hands, not because you do not love it, but because it requires an ear you do not have. And to give it to you would be to ask you to keep alive a thing that will only break your heart. You are not less daughter because you do not have the ear. You are more. You have a whole life I never had. You left this room. You have a wider world than my bench. That is what I wanted for you. That is what your mother wanted for you. If one day the person comes and opens the wall, please go and meet them. Not to take anything back, only to know that what we made has been given to the right hands. It will be a late joy for you and for me. Forgive me, I have always loved you." Margaret folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope back in her coat. She did not cry. She had cried, she said, a long time ago. "I have driven past this shop every year on Thanksgiving for the last 47 years, she said. The lights have always been off. The door has always been locked. Last week I drove past and I heard a clock ticking through the door. I sat in my car for 30 minutes. I came inside today because I have been waiting for you for 55 years. She looked at Wren. "You are the one. I brought this clock, which was my mother's, because I wanted my father's successor to be the one to repair it. I am not bitter about the gold. My father chose well. I am glad his trust was not wasted." Wren did not speak. She could not. She reached across the bench, and she took the older woman's hand in both of her own, and she held it. The two of them sat that way for a long time. Wren repaired the carriage clock in 3 days. It had not run since 1967, when Clara Hartwell had died and Samuel had wound it for the last time and put it away in a box. The mainspring needed replacing. The pivots needed oiling. The escapement needed adjustment. Wren did all of it slowly with great care because she understood, in a way she had never understood about any other piece, that this clock was not a clock. This clock was Margaret's mother. This clock was the last thing Margaret had to keep alive. When she was finished, she wound it. She set the pendulum swinging. The tick was even. Both sides of the swing were equal. Margaret returned. She picked up the clock. She held it against her ear the way Eleanor had taught Wren to hold a clock at 6 years old, and she closed her eyes and she said very softly, It sounds like my mother is in the next room. She tried to pay. Wren would not let her. Wren said the only thing she could think of, your father paid for this 55 years ago. In November, the phone rang in the shop, an old rotary phone Wren had bought at the flea market for $9, and Beth Warren was on the other end of the line. Beth did not apologize. Beth was not a woman who apologized. But Beth asked Wren how she was, and the asking was for Beth a substantial act. Wren told her about the shop. Beth was quiet for a long moment. Beth said your grandmother would be proud of you. Wren said she would be here. The call lasted 4 minutes. It was enough. Wren had not known until that moment that it would be enough. It was. On a clear evening in late October, a year and a half after the morning, she had first turned the brass key in the lock. Wren Caldwell sat on the wooden stool at the workbench and watched the last copper light of the day come through the back window and fall across the row of clocks she had taken in for repair that week. A Seth Thomas mantel clock from 1892, a Howard banjo clock from 1915, a small French carriage clock with a cracked mainspring, a pocket watch that had belonged to someone's great-aunt and had not run in 40 years. The master regulator ticked behind her, steady, even, unhurried. She thought about Eleanor, who had sat at a kitchen bench for 33 years and who had taught a 6-year-old to press her ear against the wooden case of a mantel clock and hear the difference between a healthy escapement and a limping one. She thought about Lyman Ellsworth, who had set 3 watches on a counter in 1961 and had found in a 19-year-old shop girl the ear he had been looking for 20 years. She thought about Samuel Hartwell, who on a November afternoon in 1969, with hands that had shaken and tears that had run silently, and a courage that no one had been there to witness, had taken the spring out of his own clock and sealed it into a wall and gone home because he had believed against all available evidence that someone would come. She thought about Margaret, who had not had the ear and the kindness her father had hidden inside the shape of his refusal. She thought last about herself, about the small girl on a fold-out cot in a hallway alcove who had learned to occupy less space than she needed. The girl who had walked out of a house with $380 and who had bought a clockmaker's shop with 10 of them. The girl who had been told on a long-ago Saturday by an old woman with arthritic hands and a brass loop that she had the ear. She had not in the end known what the ear was for until she had walked into a shop that had been silent for 55 years and had heard in the silence the shape of where the tick should have been. That was the thing about the listening that the grandmothers teach. You did not always know when you were 6 years old and pressing your ear to a wooden case on a Saturday afternoon that the listening was itself the trade. You learned it slowly, Saturday by Saturday, clock by clock, across a childhood measured in kitchen bench visits and the patient turning of regulation screws, while an old woman said, "Listen, can you hear it now?" And you did not always know if you were a 67-year-old man on a November afternoon in 1969, that the hardest decision of your working life would be the decision to trust a person you would never meet. Samuel Hartwell had waited 55 years to be understood. He had not lived to see the morning that someone came, but he had done the thing a man does when he does not know how the story ends. He had set down his trust in the shape of a brass key and a sealed wall and a folded letter, and he had walked out into the November afternoon of his last working day, and he had let go. The most important sound in a clockmaker's shop was not the ticking. It was the silence where the ticking should have been. And sometimes, if you were patient, and if you were lucky, and if you had been taught well, the silence waited long enough to be answered. Wren Caldwell stood up from the stool. She wound the master regulator, the last thing she did every night before she closed the shop. She wound Lyman Ellsworth's old Hamilton pocket watch, which Eleanor had wound every morning at 7:15 for 33 years, and which Wren now wound every evening at 9. She wound Henry Hartwell's Hamilton, which had been lying in a velvet cloth in the bottom drawer of the workbench when she found it, and which she had decided after reading Samuel's notebook to bring back to life. The three watches ticked together on the bench. They had been wound by 4 different hands across 103 years, and they were ticking now on the last evening of October in a small shop on Mill Street in Montague Center, at a workbench beside a window that looked out at the river. She turned out the workshop light. She left the small green-shaded lamp burning. She stood in the doorway of the shop for a long moment, the way a man had stood in that doorway on the afternoon of November 11th, 1969, and she looked back at the room, the master regulator at the back wall, the cot in the corner, the plank floor, the bench, the rows of clocks waiting their turn. She closed the door. She locked it with Samuel Hartwell's brass key. Wren Caldwell had been 20 years old and homeless. She had spent $10 on an abandoned clockmaker's shop on a side street in a small river town in the Pioneer Valley of western Massachusetts. It was the best $10 she ever spent. It was also the best $10 Samuel Hartwell ever received, because 55 years before on a cold November afternoon, he had placed a question into a wall. He had asked it without an answer. He had asked it on faith. Will somebody know? And on a March morning in 2024, a young woman with a brass loop around her neck and $10 in her pocket had walked into his shop and answered with her hands, with her ears, with her whole working life ahead of her, yes. Sometimes the answer takes 55 years. Sometimes it takes a lifetime. But if a man asks the right question, and if he trusts the answer comes, that is what a clockmaker knows. That is what every man who has ever asked a question without knowing the answer also knows. The shop was dark. The lamp burned low on the workbench. Through the wavy old glass of the front window, 3 small, steady ticks could be heard in the November cold by anyone passing on Mill Street who knew how to listen. The river ran black through the valley floor. The clocks kept time.